Hello and welcome to the Tasmanian Institute of Ag's virtual forum. We've been running a number of these and will continue to do so into the future, but today's forum is about Tasmanian agriculture in a changing climate. Firstly, as a reflection of our institution's recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Palawa people and custodians of the land upon which we meet, and pay respect to our elders past, present and emerging. My name is Nicoli Barnes and I'm a social researcher here at TIA, and I explore the social issues that arise around climate change and livestock production in Tasmania. Each year, TIA interacts with hundreds of people through our workshops, through presentations and field trips all around Tasmania. We know that not everybody is able to join us on farm, so we're offering this front row virtual forum, connecting you with experts that we have here, 5 very talented people coming along to talk to us, to explore about issues relating to the future of agriculture with the focus today on Tasmania. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get underway. Your microphone, your camera, your chat function and your raise hand function have all been disabled, so don't think that it's you, that's coming from our end, but we are encouraging you to ask questions, and this can be done at any time through the Q&A function that you'll see on your screens. You can ask questions anonymously, and at the end of the session today, we'll be answering some of these in the Q&A session. And finally, the forum is being recorded and will be live streamed on our YouTube channel, and that will be available to everybody at the end. Today, we're exploring the impact of future climates on livestock industries in Tassie. This is a huge topic. It can be controversial and it's highly complex. And today we're introducing just some of the basic key themes to start this conversation. So we're going to start with Matthew Harrison this morning. Matt is an associate professor at TIA and the director of the Carbon Storage Partnerships. His work focuses on developing sustainable pathways for balancing land use priorities in food security with those of environmental stewardship. He works with farmers and industry and government and has been working in this area to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also adapting to climate change, and has a focus on making those changes profitable, inclusive and socially acceptable. Welcome, Matt, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Nikki. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep. And thanks, Jemima, for the invitation to present. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. I've got a few slides to present. Today, I'll talk about what was called the Nexus project. The Nexus project has just finished. That was a connected system of projects across the entire eastern seaboard of Australia. We also had farms in the west. I was the leader of the Nexus project in Tasmania. The Nexus project was focused on adaptation. But as part of that adaptation, we looked at what happens to productivity, livestock productivity, profitability, and greenhouse gas emissions. We also embedded extreme climatic events, for example, drought, as part of that future climate outlook. There was a large team involved, and they're actually listed on the slide there. So the farms that we had in the Nexus project were very contrasting and very different, and that was so that we had a range of agroecological environments and production systems. So we had a farm in northern Queensland, which is sort of very much a rangeland environment, 2 seasons a year. We had a farm in eastern Gippsland, which is sort of a rolling green hill type country. We had another farm in northwestern Tasmania near Stanley, which is a sort of a cool maritime environment. And we also had a farm in southwestern WA, and that's a very short growing season, very Mediterranean type environment. The 2 farms that we had in Tasmania, which I'll be focusing on in this presentation, were at Campbelltown or near Campbelltown, and the inset map in the corner there shows that. We had actually pasture trials on farm, and that was part of an associated project called the Legumes Project. People probably don't realise, well, people outside Tasmania, that Tasmania is under a rainfall gradient, so we get high rainfall in the west, and as you go across to the eastern side and to the south, you get progressively less rainfall. So farms in the Midlands, where that blue dot is, don't actually get that much rainfall. In fact, Hobart is the 2nd driest capital city in the country. Campbelltown gets about 580 millimetres a year. The other farm was in the northwest, near the famous Stanley Nut, which is an old volcano. That's a very different production system. So that gets about 940 millimetres a year, very different soil type, so a deep red, free-draining ferrosol. And that was also a beef cattle farm. So we had a sheep farm, a big sheep farm in the Midlands, and we had a beef production system in the northwest. Probably the main thing that we found a lot of findings out of Nexus, but the main thing that the regional reference group and this group of expert practitioners and farmers and consultants were most interested in was that result there. They were most interested in the effects that we found of the beneficial effects of climate change on pasture production out to 2050 in Tasmania. Temperatures did go up. We're connected by one atmosphere, and anything that changes in that atmosphere affects pretty much everyone. Part of that was that we saw an 11% increase in global average temperatures to 2050. Rainfall went down on average, especially during winter, but that was actually slightly beneficial because growth in wintertime is constrained by temperature, not by rainfall. And we tend to have a bit of waterlogging in Tasmania in wintertime, so that was actually slightly beneficial. We saw a flattening of the peak of spring growth rate, so they didn't actually peak as much out to 2050. A beneficial effect was that lamb mortality on that Campbelltown farm went down, and that was because you had slightly more mild winters and earlier increase in temperature in springtime. So that's a productivity co-benefit of climate change. So overall, we found modest or even slightly beneficial effects of climate change on Tasmanian livestock production out to 2050. But we did find that these extremes, and Sandra will talk about this later, such as drought and heat waves and extreme rainfall, will increase in future. So you would need additional agility to adapt and additional resilience, really, to manage those extremes. We did also show that climate change will detrimentally impact soil carbon. So soil carbon sequestration, so that's the rate of improvement of soil carbon, will go down to 2050 by up to 133%. We did also find that soil carbon stocks, that's the absolute amount of soil carbon on the northwestern farm, will fall. So even though climate change had a beneficial effect on pastures, soil carbon, because the soils warm up and they respire more and lose more CO2, actually went down. So if you're locking into a soil carbon market for 25 years, the likelihood that the climate will change during the period of that soil carbon market is almost certain. So to overcome that effect of climate change, we developed these adaptation mitigation bundles, and these themes were proposed by the farmers. So it was demand-driven research. We modelled what they suggested. One of them was low-hanging fruit, which is simple, immediate and reversible changes. Another one was called towards carbon neutral, to reduce emissions year on year. And that's part of that is through sequestration. Part of it is through emissions mitigation. Another one was income diversification. If you get more droughts in future and the rain doesn't fall as much, in theory, well, then what else can you do to get income from other enterprise mixes? Part of what we looked at was irrigated grapevines. Part of what we looked at for the northwestern farm was wind turbines, so getting income from an energy company. We also looked at climatic exposure. Now, if you have a farm in one location of the state, the likelihood that you get a drought across the entire state is probably lower. So we looked at purchasing another farm in the northeast of Tasmania, which gets a different climate to the northwest. Now, the regional reference group, or this group of farmers, were interested in that towards carbon neutral option, but they also challenged us with what it actually costs to be carbon neutral. They said, well, it's all very well to reduce emissions, but tell us what it costs to be carbon neutral today. So part of that, what I'll present shortly, will be on that. There's a fair bit of information in this chart, and I won't go into all the details. On the x-axis, we've got livestock productivity. At the end of the day, we need to have food security. We need to produce enough food particularly for developing countries, for poverty alleviation and that sort of thing. Farms are businesses. They need to make money. We need to be internationally competitive. So profit and gross margin is also important. So anything higher is potentially better. We also looked at ease of adoption. So a red dot means it's not very adoptable, and green dot means it's highly adoptable, and that was ranked by the farmer group. We found that purchasing an extra farm was beneficial in terms of production and profit, but was detrimental in terms of emissions. So this comes back to the namesake of the project, You improve productivity and you improve profit, which is good, but there's a tight coupling between productivity and emissions, and it's very hard to break. You increase production, you increase emissions, and that's exactly what purchasing an extra farm did. Buying a wind turbine company didn't change farm emissions because the emissions would be owned by that company. They improved profit though, which was beneficial. Probably the main one that we found was transformational feed conversion efficiency. So that's the rate with which animals put on weight. So if you eat 1 kilo of food, you might put on 200 grams. An improved feed conversion efficiency would be when you eat 1 kilo of food and you put on 500 grams. So it's got improved feed conversion efficiency. It's the opposite of humans. Humans try to lose weight. We're trying to get animals to put on weight. So feed conversion efficiency was one of the most prospective options. It reduced emissions, it improved productivity, and it also improved profitability. And there weren't really many interventions that actually did that. So the baseline farm, if you look at that pink star, anything that's above that line is beneficial in terms of profit. Anything that's below that pink star is detrimental. Asparagopsis, and we hear a lot about seaweed, had the biggest effect on emissions of anything, and that's because it reduced enteric methane. Enteric methane is typically the biggest greenhouse gas emissions of all farms, but Asparagopsis at contemporary costs also had the biggest cost. So it really highlights the trade-off between emissions mitigation and cost. I think I've said most of that, so I'll jump on to the next slide, and this is my last technical slide. To come back to the question, what does it actually cost to be carbon neutral? If you look at the baseline emissions of the farm, and that's the emissions that it produces today, it was about 4,000 tonnes of CO2 equivalents per year. Farmers could be net zero today if they purchased all carbon, if they offset all of that, and that would cost more than half of your farm's income, which is really a good thing, because if it was cheap, everyone would be doing it, but the atmosphere would see no net mitigation and no net global temperature mitigation. So it's actually a good thing that carbon credits cost a lot. Feeding Asparagopsis, or feeding red seaweed, to all weaned animals, and this ignores the practical barriers of actually doing it, but it's just a theoretical modelling study, almost cut farm emissions in half. So it has a big effect on emissions, but you'd still have half of your emissions left. So you'd still have to buy $172,000 worth of credits to be net zero. And then we said, well, what happens if you feed Asparagopsis and you plant 50 hectares of trees? Well, that reduces emissions by another 800 tonnes, but you've still got 1,300 tonnes of CO2 equivalents from your farm. So it's very hard to be actually carbon neutral. And the way that most farms that are carbon neutral is that they actually purchase offsets so that they reduce their residual emissions to zero. So I'll just skip over the detail there, but you can actually be carbon neutral, but we found that you'd have to feed Asparagopsis seaweed to all weaned livestock. You'd have to plant 85 hectares of trees for carbon sequestration, and you'd have to change your genotype to an improved feed conversion efficiency. So to come back to the question of the slide, what does it cost to be net zero? Well, it costs anything from more than half of your farm's annual income if you purchase emissions to actually an income gain if you've got a productivity co-benefit. So if you improve livestock production, you can actually improve your profit. I won't go into the details of that other one. It was similar. There's multiple pathways to net zero. There are a lot more details of those two publications. The first one is published, that's online. The second one is also online, and that's under review. So just to conclude, we found beneficial effects of climate change out to 2050 in Tasmania, modestly beneficial, not hugely beneficial. We found that soil carbon sequestration will go down. We found significant trade-offs between productivity, profitability, emissions mitigation, as well as social factors. And I haven't even talked about them, things like adoptability. Transformational feed conversion efficiency and purchasing an extra farm had the biggest effect on production and profit, whereas Asparagopsis, or seaweed, had the biggest effect on emissions, but it was also the most costly. We found a disincentive to offset, purchase all your carbon credits outright, and an incentive to inset, to sequester carbon on farm, and that's actually cheaper. We found many different pathways to net zero, but the cost of those pathways varies widely. I didn't show it, but planting trees had a bigger effect on farm emissions than soil carbon sequestration. Now, really, this is probably one of the main ones. Interventions that reduce methane that sequester carbon and improve livestock productivity, so you've got 3 interventions there, were more profitable under future climates. And even knowing that, even knowing you've got an intervention that's going to reduce emissions, improve productivity and improve profit, there's still other barriers that prevent adoption. So you need the knowledge to do it, you need the skills to do it. So you really need multidisciplinary studies to address these climate challenges. So I'll stop there, Nikki, and hand over to the next person.
Thanks for that, Matt. We're going to be chatting now with Julia, or Julia's going to be chatting with us, I should say. Julia is the Carbon Neutral 2023 Project Manager at MLA, or Meat and Livestock Australia. Julia has a background in agricultural science, ag tech and startup investment. And in her role, Julia identifies high impact R&D opportunities to be able to deliver progress towards net emissions reduction. Welcome, Julia, and I'll leave it with you.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Matt. What a setup for me to take over to talk more about the big picture of CN30 and what it means for our industry. We've got some fantastic speakers on the call who are going to bring it down to earth and how they incorporate CN30 principles on farm. But for my talk, I'll be looking more at the big picture trends, how we measure CN30 progress as an industry. And I might be able to address some of the points that Matt very rightly raised, but perhaps with an angle that they're not as much cause for concern right now for producers, given what interventions we have today. So CN30 is the red meat industry's voluntary target to achieve a net zero emissions position, or carbon neutrality, by 2030. It accounts for on-farm feedlot and processing across beef, sheep and goats. And this is a collective goal. So this is not a requirement for all producers to be carbon neutral on farm. This is measured at the aggregate, and it really is a North Star for industry to move towards. It was first announced in 2017 and has really given the red meat sector a first mover advantage over some of the other agricultural commodities who are yet to set an emissions target. The strategy we've considered is really designed with those win-win benefits in mind that Matt touched on. And we ultimately want to be driving solutions for our industry from within it and not have people from outside suggesting what those should be. We want to really own our own narrative with CN30. The latest modelling reflects that we're actually well on our way towards net emissions reduction. So the latest figures released this month show that the red meat sector's reduced by 64.9% its net emissions since 2005. So a really tremendous story that we should be proud of. And this is measured again at that national level. One thing that's very important to note, as it does kind of cloud the conversation, is that figure, that progress reporting, is completely independent of any activity in the carbon market around offsets and credits. So that number just accounts for real or biophysical change within our industry. Now, these reductions to date are largely from increased carbon storage in vegetation in Northern Australia. There is also in this particular latest update some impact in sheep flock numbers being reduced from the 2019 drought. There's some impact from gradual production efficiencies since 2005, though that's really the nut to crack for our industry and is a large focus of our R&D portfolio, trying to discover, commercialise new interventions that address livestock emissions released in production. So what we'll see from the R&D sector is new interventions, particularly around genetics and low methane production and low methane pastures, enter the market in the next 2 to 5 years for early adopters. So CN30 has inspired significant sums of co-investment to flock to this challenge, and MLA's invested just over $140 million in emissions avoidance technology and research like Matt's related to carbon co-benefits and really quantifying the benefit of incorporating more carbon on farm. One of the key focuses that attracts a lot of the media attention is, of course, low methane additives. These include red asparagus, the seaweed product mentioned before, synthetic bromoform products, citrus oils, and another well-profiled product called Bovair, which is a synthetic product that has been shown to reduce emissions by up to 90% in feedlot. So they're obviously very promising and very exciting results to be seeing in the real world. The challenge for us now and for industry is how do we deliver those additives to the 95% of animals that are raised in a grass-fed grazing system. So we're looking at water dosing, a lick block, a biodegradable bolus, as well as some really exciting early life programming trials. So looking at whether exposure at a young age or in utero carries a benefit throughout an animal's life. So if we expose an animal to a methane suppressing additive, does that change the microbiome of the rumen for the rest of that animal's life and have a longer term impact? These areas are one to watch. There's some really exciting things happening in genetics as well, as also around in pastures, breeding for lower methane feed-based types. There'll be no one silver bullet in this space. But right now, managing for emissions on farm looks a lot like managing for production efficiency, as we've always done. So it's important that CN30 isn't siloed. I think it can tend to seem like all new shiny things, but really what CN30 looks like on farm today is managing for farm performance. Kilos of live weight and dollars have a direct relationship with emissions, and particularly a particular focus for us is emissions intensity. So how can we drive down greenhouse gases per kilo of live weight that we produce? How do we do this? Nothing that will be new to the producers and agri-corporates in the audience. A focus on reproduction, weight for age, maintaining ground cover, more grass, more product in less time, like we've always done and like we always have wanted to focus on, but just connecting that kilos and efficiency with the emissions story as well.
Julie, I might stuck in there. That's our time up. So cool. We'll move on with Hugh. Thank you very much for your time on that. And I know there's some questions coming through here that are looking really interesting for later on. So I think
great.
I'd also encourage everybody just to keep putting those questions up if you've got them. Please put them in the Q&A button. Our next speaker is Hugh Christie, who is the CEO of Tasmanian Farmers and Graziers Association. Hugh has a background in farming and degrees in environmental engineering and business administration. He's worked as an extension officer, but his position as the CEO of the TFGA focuses on developing a sustainable and productive Tasmanian ag sector. So welcome, Hugh, and I'll hand over to you.
I guess from the TFGA with where we're sitting, I've really enjoyed the last two talks about practical differences, and I think the key message from Julia is it's about an efficient business tends to be a lower emitting business is key. But for us too, I mean, a lot of our focus is on how do we have a balance in the sustainability discussions. We're doing things like we're increasing our efforts around the sustainability measures, things like that. But I guess for me, the bigger picture here is we can do all these things, but there also needs to be the framework for demonstration. So now we spend a lot of time, not just in Tasmania, but more broadly through the NFF, talking at a national level about how do we capture the benefits of these things for issues such as market access, demonstration of sustainability globally, and issues such as that, because through that demonstration, it's things like, if you look at things like the EU Free Trade Agreement, sustainability keeps coming through, and it's something particularly developed markets want to see. So where a lot of our focus is making sure that we can show that, as Matt was talking about, a range of production systems across Australia, and they can all be sustainable, and making sure that Tasmania and Australia can own the narrative of what is sustainable, so that we can keep supporting things like the commitments from Ministers Watt and Bowen when New Zealand came out with quite pecuniary impacts on livestock through methane reductions. And we've got settings where, through the work of MLA and TIA and other bodies, the government wants to see us to do mitigation rather than reduction of herd size. And part of that is making sure we can have the policy settings that support that narrative, support the demonstration by farmers on what they're doing, and give confidence that agriculture is making its contribution. The other flip side that I think is really important to this that we've got to focus on is understanding of that narrative of what we can do about climate change and how we can demonstrate sustainable production, is making sure that people understand the risks. So, what do you do with your sequestration? The concept of the carbon markets and whether or not farmers should be participating in those markets, or whether that carbon sequestration, that carbon credit is actually an incredibly important thing for access to markets for products. So making sure that producers actually have access to that range of information so they can make informed decisions about what they do on their farm, what they do with their carbon credits, and how they set their business up for success over the next 30 years. Slight variation from livestock, but I think Matt's talking about on-farm forestry as a sequestration process. Even something like that, making sure you understand what's required in terms of management of your agroforestry, so you're actually getting the carbon sequestration that you're claiming at the start of the process, so you don't turn around in 20 years' time finding a shortfall. So making sure farmers have the tools to navigate what is an incredibly complex system with confidence, and in a way that makes sure that their profitability across their enterprise is maximised, because fundamentally that'll be the key thing. If a farm's profitable, they can afford to invest in these issues. If a farm's not profitable, it makes it pretty hard to invest in anything. But I guess that's a broad overview from me. We're very much in that policy advocacy space. I think today's more about the people talking about practical research and things that help farmers identify improved practices on farm. So I'm quite happy to stop there and leave it to the researchers and people delivering the projects.
Thanks, Hugh. That was really good to have you here anyway. We're going to welcome Sandra Knowles now. Sandra leads the Tasmanian Farm Innovation Hub, which helps Tasmanian farmers and those who support them to build valuable relationships and access critical information with a focus on climate resilience. Sandra has extensive knowledge of the Tasmanian agricultural industry and helps manage a mixed farming family enterprise as well. So welcome, Sandra.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me here. I'm the director of the Tas Farm Innovation Hub, and we're one of 8 drought resilience hubs established across the country, funded by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. So I guess, in a way, we're a new intervention by the federal government to work with industry and researchers to try and trial some of these interventions on farm. We work with a national network of industry and community partners across Tasmania and the rest of the country. We have 22 partners and 7 additional delivery partners with our projects. We also have 15 other organisations collaborating on those projects on the ground, where we're learning by doing. Our main aim of the hub is to actually help farmers access information and drive innovation in their businesses to try and encourage and ensure financial, social and environmental resilience to drought and climate variability. To enable this information flow, the hubs and all the hubs nationally are actually based in either a university or a national grower group. And we're based under the umbrella of TIA in the University of Tasmania. And we've got staff sitting in the south of Tassie, and also our headquarters based in Launceston. We also have a collaboration and partnership with Rural Business Tas, where we also have a shopfront presence in York Street in Launceston, and also in Longford in their offices. We also work closely with the TIA team, but also the other 7 hubs nationally. So any relevant research that we need to translate and work with industry to find out what's relevant is not only internally in Tasmania, but also right across the nation, which we have found a really good collaborative model. The hub has actually two main streams of federal government funding, and that's in the ag innovation space and the drought resilience space. One set of funding came from DAF, the other from the Future Drought Fund. And at the moment, we have in total 17 projects underway with some of our 22 partners and also our delivery partners that are not partners. This has enabled us to have more meaningful networks. It's very hard to come in as a new shiny intervention and actually not create another set of stakeholder saturation. So we're trying to work with our current partners. We have some of the projects that we're actually working on at the moment. One is integrating trees into farm plans to improve resilience to drought. We're also investigating soil health sensing technologies. Another project is supporting drought and climate resilience in Aboriginal farm enterprises. Another's engaging and promoting innovation in agriculture to inspire our next generation of producers via the Hagley Farm School and the TFGA, which is a collaborative project. We're also funded a small amount of funding via AgriFutures as well, and we're working with our hub partner Beanstalk, where we're mapping ag tech use in Tasmania, including in livestock, and we're investigating barriers to digital literacy and exploring what's actually happening in Tasmania at the moment around the natural capital accounting in that space. While all our projects have completely different focuses or foci, they all share a common thread of supporting locally relevant solutions to support drought and climate resilience. The two projects that I will highlight in more detail, the first is a collaboration in that national sphere with the Victorian, South Australian and the Tasmanian hub, where we're working together to support the management of pastures and the use of livestock containment and feeding systems for drought resilience. This is actually being led by one of our hub partners, Derwent Catchment Project, who are working with a range of producers on country and on their farms to understand the current use of containment feeding and the barriers to its actual use in Tasmania, and also to determine locally relevant trigger points for containment feeding decision making in Tassie as well. And another project that we're working on with another partner is AgLogic, where we're supporting the establishment of soil moisture probe and weather station networks across Northwest Coast, King Island, Flinders Island, East Coast and the Midlands area. AgLogic, who are actually in Ulverston at the moment with a workshop with producers, it's looking at using soil moisture and local weather data to support decisions in irrigation management, stock levels, disease and pest management and pasture species selection. So I can see my time's up. So that's just a quick snapshot of what we're doing and the work that the hub is doing to support farmers and enable them to adapt and respond to future climate variability. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. And we'll move on to our final speaker, Mark. Mark Bennett, together with his wife Carol and son John, runs Barnett Angus at Westbury in northern Tasmania. They have 60 hectares of dryland operation that focus on a stud cattle breeding and ET and IVF technologies. Mark takes a low input approach and is passionate about regenerative ag practices to continuously improve soil and enhance the environment for his cattle to thrive. So Mark, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Nikki. To start off, I just want to let you know I left farming about 20 or 30 years ago in my early 30s, came back to it in my 50s. And what I've noticed is from a climate perspective, there's no question the climate's changed. It's more variable, it's more unpredictable. The extremes are more extreme. And all of that provides significant challenges for agriculture as if we haven't got enough of them. To give you a bit of understanding of our operation, we have a technology-driven, I guess, Angus herd. It's a small herd of donor cows. We do a lot of IVF work. We do a lot of ET, and all of that is wrapped up in in our own R&D project as well. We focus on high growth animals that have high carcass values, high intermuscular fat, with the belief that if we can get that right, it'll flow through the supply chain all the way through to the customer in the restaurant, and that's where we will ultimately get our premium from. We have 2 small farms, and one is a dryland farm, irrigation, 20 to 25 inch rainfall. Another has double that rainfall out at Meander, and it is got plenty of irrigation, 280 meg dam on it. So we're going to have busy springs and summers with irrigators out there. And the reason that we bought that property was to try and balance the dryland nature of the property that is our, I guess, our early purchase here at Westbury. The way we look at sustainability, I guess, what we're trying to do through our genetic improvement is to develop low-cost, carbon-efficient, high-growth cattle with great carcass values, and all of that ends up with a conversation about net feed intake. And so we measure everything to the nth degree to try and work out genetically how net feed intake can be a heritable exercise. So that's one of the tools that we have in the kit bag. We also in the process of planting tree lines, that those trees come from seeds from our best gum trees and our best blackwood trees. And we don't do that specifically to create carbon in the soil. It's more about shelter belts and creating the biodiversity within the farm or even beyond the farm boundary. And I guess dovetailing that into the multi-seed pasture mixes that we use, the regenerative ag practices, it's complementary to our biodiversity that we're trying to create on the farm. And I'm not suggesting that we're expert at it by any means, but we're getting better at it. And so we look at carbon not to sell off to a broker for a quick sugar fix, but to add value to our genetics in the future. We suspect that, by 2030, those values will be much higher than they are now, and we're hopeful that our genetic improvement will be significant. And so we bundle those two things together, and we can improve the value of our stock. I guess the other carbon component, obviously, with the pasture biodiversity and the trees, that adds value to the carbon as well. We talked also about Asparagopsis. I see that to some extent as a drug. We can fix it tomorrow, but then we've got to use it again the next day. And that's all very well if the cost equation is okay, but ultimately that needs to be determined or developed in the context of genetic heritability, so that we can wean ourselves off that drug. So that's the way I look at Asparagopsis and the like. So I guess in summary, what we're trying to do is to improve our genetics to develop the carbon cattle, if you like, that are high growth, high carcass value animals that have a net feed intake that is better than the previous generation. And then we balance that up with the biodiversity of our shelter belts and our pastures. And hopefully we can contribute from a carbon point of view and extract that value, not today, not tomorrow, but come late 20s, 2030, when we can match it with our genetic improvement that we've developed through our cattle. So that gives you a little bit of a rundown of how crazy we actually are.
Thank you so much. That was really great, Mark. It's nice to see some stuff in practice happening, and it's always a lovely segue into question time, because I know a lot of farmers will be wanting to know exactly how do you do all this type of thing. We've got a number of questions in the Q&A, and I think I might just go from the top if that's all right with everyone. I think if I hit the button, can people see those or no? I'll read them out. So measuring carbon sequestration on farm, how does that happen? Matt, you might be a good one for this one.
Yeah, that's a good question. The Nexus project was a modelling study. So we use deterministic or biophysical models that simulate processes such as tree growth and pasture growth. We have really good models set up for that, so it was modelled rather than measured. Measuring is very costly, and there's what's called the Soil Carbon Innovation Challenge to try to reduce the costs of measuring soil carbon. But measuring carbon in trees is also very difficult to do. So physical measurement, expensive and time consuming.
Yeah. Right, another question is, what tree species are planted to mitigate climate change in Tasmania?
Yeah, I think that was just following on my tree one, Nikki. What we assumed was environmentally appropriate trees. So we assumed Tasmanian blue gums in the north, and in the Midlands farm, I can't remember what species it was, but we assumed we would thicken up the existing bushlands with environmentally contextualised species. So it was specific to region. But people say plant a tree and sort of don't think about it much. There is a lot of work in getting a tree successfully established and to live, sort of thing, with nutrition and timing and the right time of the year and ripping, sort of thing. So there's a lot of work in planting and keeping trees alive.
Can I just add to that, Matthew, if I may? Our program is based on wandering around the farm at seed time, tree seed time, and finding our best specimens. And growing them from seed. So that creates a scenario where we can genuinely say that these trees have been the most productive in this particular environment, and we replicate that. We went through the process of thinking, righto, well, there's some great gum trees on the East Coast, there's some great trees here and there's some great trees there, but I don't believe that there's any better tree than the best one that grows in your own environment. And so I'd encourage people to think about collecting those seeds and multiplying them on your own in your own environment.
Thanks, Mark. Another question: have any of the research groups looked into the benefits of anaerobic digesters at feedlots? Anybody heard of any of those?
I can say.
Go for it, Matt. Sorry.
I think I just, sorry, Julie, if I cut you off, I just muted myself. Developing countries often have anaerobic digesters, and they've had it for a long time, just with single animal operations where they actually, it's part of burning the manure, sort of thing, and capturing the methane off them. Dairies also can have anaerobic digesters. I think the problem with them, piggeries too, I think the problem with them is that they're expensive. So to capture that methane, and methane is really natural gas, and to use it, sort of thing, is a really good idea, but it comes down to, again, the cost. Julie, you might have comments on that.
No, that more or less captured it. MLA does have a portfolio of feedlot investment into emissions reduction tech, but I have heard the same comments, and that issues with contamination in the manure mix in an open feedlot compared to a closed, confined piggery plays a role in whether it's feasible or not to capture the methane. But I'm sure there are examples of it in use.
Just quickly, and I think that's a key thing, Julia. It comes down to the production system of what you're working with. I know, for example, in California, they have a lot of shedded dairies, for example, and they have the anaerobic digesters, and you've actually got a methane production fueling trucking fleets, but it's very much coming down to the production systems that are prevalent and how well you can capture and use that. So feedlots may be an option, but it's how you make it work.
Thank you.
Cool.
Another question. We cold mitigate a huge amount of methane emissions by using Bovaer. I don't know whether I pronounced that right, but in dairies and feedlots. Where is it practical to use, and why aren't we doing this? The cost to the consumer would be insignificant, about 130k per supermarket. They turn over 43 million for each store. So
I'll take this one to start. So I will say that a lot of the agri-corporates in feedlot and dairy are investing their own money into research on methane additives, and they're definitely the first cab off the rank, if you will, for trialling these additives. It's a very controlled environment. I think you underestimate perhaps the cost of that technology at the moment. So best case scenario for Bovaer today would be a 27 cents per head per day regimen. So it's not for everyone. It's certainly not at a price point that it's highly attractive for industry to adopt, particularly in the absence of consumer premiums. And there's not a lot of premium from the market to pay for this kind of technology yet as a consumer, to really incentivize those businesses to introduce additives. It would currently be at a loss, but we are looking at expanding the opportunities under the Clean Energy Regulator for businesses who do choose to adopt methane additives to be able to be to receive a credit allocation for emissions avoided through additives. So it's trending there, but it's quite an expensive undertaking.
I might just add to that, Julia. I'm working with the government on that, so there will be a livestock feed emissions supplement mitigation method or policy come out soon. The idea is to credit people who feed supplements to reduce emissions, but really that Bovaer or Asparagopsis or any feed supplement, like Mark said before, is you have to do it every day. The mitigation and the science is probably there, but the practical barriers associated with feeding it in the paddock to them every day still exist. So the problem is getting it to them. So in dairies, you can manipulate what they eat on a daily basis. So it could be argued that might be a bit easier. Grazing animals in a paddock, if they're over the other side of the paddock, how can you control what they eat in terms of feed supplement? So Julia mentioned low methanogenic pastures before, so that reduces enteric methane when they eat it. So that's one possibility, but feed supplements, there's a lot of practical barriers still to be worked out with that.
I think on the positive thing, sorry, just quickly, Matt, I know through Asparagopsis trials, for example, they have had a line of low methane burgers in grilled restaurants, and they went really well. People were willing to pay extra money to feel good, to feel slightly better about the burger they were eating. But as you said, Matt, it's how you get that on a large scale, so it's an industry-wide thing. But there are some examples out there where, not necessarily in supermarkets, but people have actively paid a premium for low methane options.
Yeah, I think I mean, Julia has the numbers better than I do, but I think it's something like 1 in 5 people say they'll pay up to 25% more for a carbon neutral or low emissions product. What people say and what they do are probably two different things. But there is interest in low emissions products sort of thing. And yeah, so I don't know whether you want to expand on that, Julia.
Oh, I think you're exactly right. The proof is sort of yet to be in the pudding, although that the grilled methane burger promotion, pay $1 extra for the 60% reduced methane burger has been popular. But what we're seeing is that consumers rather, are still driven by that functional benefit. Is it healthy? Is it tasty? That's the primary driver. And then if you can tack on sustainability to that, that just sweetens the deal. But those sort of, health, taste, freshness, still the primary driver.
Okay, next question. Mark, I think this one will be directed at you. What specific challenges have you encountered as a farmer or grazier in adapting to a changing climate in Tassie?
Basically getting older, I think. We can't predict what the next 3 or 4 months looks like. From a moisture point of view, we have a farm that in the summer here at Westbury can be a dust bowl, or we've the last couple of years we've had a couple of sensational periods. One of the things that we've done is build a feed pad here. So the first year we were here, we made a shocking mess of our paddocks with our cattle. During the winter period, we were feeding them because we'd almost run out of feed, and we'd bog the thing up, and the pastures just didn't recover properly, and we wrecked a couple of pastures, and so we built a feed pad now to get them off that, and then we've been trying to work out how to extract value out of that feed pad, and so we put animals in there, and we get them off our pastures, and we fatten them, and we manage their feed intake a little better, which creates an environment for us so we can measure that net feed intake scenario. So I guess that's probably one of the things we, because we have a small operation, but we do have 2 properties that are complementary to each other in terms of where their feed, when the feed is growing, and we balance it up that way. If you'd said to me 5 years ago, will you be spending so much money on a property another half an hour away, I would have thought you were nuts. But, you know, from a strategic point of view, that's, I'm sure it'll turn out to be a real blessing in the coming years.
Great. A couple of legumes and grasses questions here. I'll read both of them. Matt, you might be good for these ones, I think. So there's one that says, what legumes and grasses are resilient to climate changes in Tasmania? And the second one is, will persistent perennial pasture mixtures of grass, legumes and herb mixes provide better options for carbon sequestration and productivity compared to annual blends that need resowing year after year?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll address the second one first. It all depends on where you're starting from. So if your soil carbon is already high, like 4 or 5 or 6%, well, it doesn't really matter what you do. You probably won't increase much further. That's called a ceiling level. And beyond that ceiling level, you can't really much improve. If you're starting from a low base, like 0.5%, it doesn't really matter what you do. You can improve it. It really just depends on above ground productivity. So if you improve above ground productivity through a new pasture, through fertilisation, through irrigation, well, then you improve soil carbon. If your productivity goes down due to erosion or overgrazing or whatever, your soil carbon will go down. So it's a lagged effect. Productivity, then a few years later, soil carbon. To come back to the first question, resilient pasture species for, I think, drought or water deficit. Well, again, that really depends on probably where you are. And I mean, there's 2 different things. And this sort of comes back to the carbon, climate change, productivity point. You could have drought resilience, but it might not necessarily be digestible or have metabolizable energy. And as a grazier, you're probably wanting something that's digestible as well. And so that enables weight gain sort of thing. We didn't essentially look at drought resilience of pastures, and there are other experts within TIA that can advise on that. There's also Sandra, who does a lot of projects in drought resilience sort of thing. One thing we did find is that legumes, incorporating legumes within grass pasture mixes, can enhance overall productivity. Even if it doesn't enhance overall productivity, it can improve live weight gain per hectare because they're more digestible. There's more energy per hectare. So even you could have something that's highly productive, but unless it's digestible to the animal, it might not necessarily improve production per hectare. Sandra, did you want to expand on that at all? Or?
Not at this stage, because I think we've only got about 2 minutes left, Matt.
We've got a couple of other really great questions.
Yeah,
Dan.
exactly.
We're trying to pick one.
Coming up.
Sandra, why don't we give you one? What partnerships or collaborations has the Farm Innovation Hub established with other organisations, researchers, research institutions or industry bodies to foster agricultural innovation?
So with the Tas Farm Innovation Hub, when the actual deed was signed with the federal government, we had 21 partners actually sign up to partner with us. So Look, I won't bore you with listing out the 22. Mel might put the web page link on the chat, but we're linked into Tas Irrigation, Hydro Tas. We're also linked in very closely with the NRMs. And then Beanstalk has been a really good partnership for us as well. It's enabled us to actually get a national company that has international experience to actually come in and hone in on how do we get innovation to help get people resilient to drought. And so it's enabled us to do the ag tech mapping, and we've chosen 4 sectors. And then when it's connected to university, we're nested under TIA, but there's also 8 other universities that we can tap into through the network. Our role is to take the great research and help translate it with industry so we can enable impact on the ground. So for us, we will partner with anyone who can help.
Great. I believe that might be just about our time up. What the TIA has done is to be able to get us a direct link so that if you put your questions in the question and answer box, we will get back to them. So if you've got those questions, please keep them coming through and we will get back to you with them. I think I've got time for one more question, I'm being told here. How much confidence can farmers have in their soil carbon sequestration efforts if we're looking at an overall decline under future climate scenarios?
I'm happy to have a go at that one. The likelihood that you'll be able to sequester more carbon under future climates is context specific. If it was all uniform and we were starting from the same base, which we're not, but soils vary from metre to metre, the ability to sequester carbon under a warmer climate would go down in future because soils warm up and they respire more and lose more carbon. But that said, if you're starting from a low base and you're a bare ground paddock, then your ability to sequester more carbon in future is quite high. So it's very much dependent on where you're starting today, whether or not you can sequester carbon. So it's not a generic solution or a blanket solution. It's very much where the paddock is at today.
Great. All right, well, I might just wrap things up there now. It's been a wonderful opportunity to hear from our speakers, and thank you very much to the 5 of you for your time and your insights today. And it's always encouraging to see so many people from all parts of our industry who are interested in hearing about how we can begin to approach what's a pretty difficult and often complex issue around climate change. So thank you for showing your interest and in your attendance, and we'll be sending out links to the actual YouTube so that you can either have another view through what some of the answers are, or you can share it. And there's also a TIA email account if you have other or further questions that you'd like to send through, and we can find some answers for you. Before you leave, please take a moment to complete this short feedback form that's on your screen. And we thank you for taking part in this event and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.